Hi guys, welcome to another video. So today what we're going to do is have a look at the key concepts surrounding the Sweeney. This is interesting for those of you who are going to be studying crime drama as part of component 2. For those of you who are doing sitcom, I will be releasing similar videos for the IT crowd and friends at a later date. So make sure that you're subscribed and you have your notifications turned on for when I release those on YouTube. So starting off with language then, again this is something that was covered in more detail through the analysis of the whole episode and the case study of the Sweeney, so make sure you go to the playlist tab and you check that out if you haven't seen it already. In terms of key features of media language, so we've got a lot of stereotypes that are being played on, both in terms of gender, in terms of character roles, and in terms of settings and the action that happens within the show as well. We've got a lot of varied camera shots, and we've also got a more muted colour palette, which is sort of representative of the time that this was produced. In terms of industry, this was produced by Thames Television, who are quite an established and long-running production company, and it's then been distributed by Fremantle Media, which again is a very long-running distribution company. Unlike Luther, we do know the budget for each episode, so this had a budget of roughly £260,000 per episode, and given that it ran for a total of 53 episodes, that's an awful lot of money to be spending on a production, particularly for the era. Now, the show itself ran from January 1975 to December 1978. We've got 4 seasons, as we said, with 53 episodes, but it's also based off a movie surrounding the main character Regan in 1974. So you could argue that there are sort of 54 episodes if we count that movie as the origins of the show. In terms of our audience, primary audience are going to be 18 to 30-year-old men, B to D, who are aspirers and mainstreamers. The primary audience we are looking at the time of production. So today our primary audience would be sort of the 50 to 70-year-old men, women who are HC2 and who are resigned. It was really difficult to try and pinpoint the audience here because it's difficult to know whether to look at the primary audience who are perhaps watching it today or the primary audience for when the show originated. If we're talking about the primary demographic for the show today, then we would just swap round the two details that I've got here. I hope that makes sense. In terms of representation, we've got a lot of heightened masculinity. So Regan is presented as very masculine and traditionally masculine for the period, holding sort of traditional values and beliefs that people would have followed within the 1970s. We've also got a very clear hierarchy of power, not only in terms of people within the police force, but also in terms of men and women. Now, women actually have increased power. We see that through Jenny's job and also through the fact that we have a female officer who comes to sit with her and guard her effectively. But they are also considered in need of rescuing, so Jenny is the first port of call to sort of target Regan. Now, the police are also represented as a sort of grey area here, so they're not necessarily represented as a force of good, but equally they're not represented as a force of bad either, and they're shown as being operating somewhere between those two signs. So we've got that sort of binary opposition here that makes the show quite interesting. In terms of context, society at the time was sort of an increase, a lot of increase in sort of negativity. So we had an increase in racism within the police force. We'd got an increase in terms of crime, which we'll get onto in just a second. In terms of positives, unemployment was at an all-time low, which was good on the one hand because it meant that the economy was doing very well, but on the other hand, it sort of meant that people didn't necessarily have to try, or sort of as my father put it, he didn't really have to try because he knew that he would be able to get a job, and it wasn't a case of going for an interview or handing in a CV. It was, can I have a job? Yes, here you go. There was also an increase in women's rights and feminist movements as well. And again, social context and cultural context sort of link together, and there's a lot of crossover between the two. So along with this sort of increased racism within the police force, that might be due to the fact that this was a very divisive time, particularly between the young and old generations, but also between people who did have and people who didn't have, through people who were starting to become more enlightened and who were starting to become more socially aware and people who weren't. So in terms of further cultural context, the church played a very large role in people's lives, and it was very unusual to see people not being in church. Equally, people had a lot of family values, and the family unit tended to be quite close. If not living together, then certainly living close by. You wouldn't get as many people as you do today moving away from their homes and moving away from their families. However, as we've said, in social context, younger generations were starting to rebel against the boundaries that were put in place by parents and society by starting to hold varied beliefs from their parents and from society, but also through their dress codes, the sort of paths of life that they followed. We had sort of an increase in, or a build up to, the mod and rocker period, where we had more sort of street violence, which was obviously represented within the Sweeney. Now, in terms of historical context, it was also a period of unrest in the 1970s, and a lot of people, or sort of in terms of the research that I was doing, a lot of people defined it as quite a bleak time within the UK. So despite the fact we'd got unemployment at an all-time low, despite the fact that women's rights were increasing, it was a period of great unrest. So there were several really major strikes that happened within the UK at the time, particularly the 1974 miners' strike, which actually led to a blackout in London because there wasn't enough sort of electricity to fuel everything. The PIRA had also been active in the UK, planting bombs in cars and in train stations. Now, that's part of our history that we have to be aware of, but it's also something that's quite interesting when we think of the Sweeney, because it might be that people were drawn to crime dramas because there was so much unrest in their own lives that they wanted to see that brought to justice in some way, and by watching that on the screen and watching the sort of criminals being brought to justice, it could give them hope. In terms of politics, the Conservatives were in power during the 1970s. Initially, the Prime Minister was Edward Heath, who had come from somewhat humble beginnings. He was then succeeded by Margaret Thatcher, who again was a very divisive figure in British politics. So all in all, a very divisive time. Hopefully that was useful for you guys. If you don't know any of these key terms, make sure you're making definitions either in note cards or as a little glossary that you might find useful. If you haven't already, please subscribe. Hit the button below for every subscriber. You will get a shout out in the next video, and I will be one step closer to being able to use that community tab for you guys on YouTube as well. If you would like to, please leave any questions, comments, ideas, suggestions down in the comment section below, or you can get in touch with me through social media, either on Twitter or on Instagram, and I will see you guys later for another video.